mythological, or it's true. So that was the setup for my last novel, which is about a woman who wakes up one day and whose husband says that they can speak to the spirits of the dead. Because I think for many of us, if your partner were to come out with something like that, your first hope would be like, oh, maybe? Because the alternate explanations maybe are even more troubling, depending on your epistemology. This book was nothing as direct in terms of inspiration. It was a kind of more of a soup, a stew of things, which I think is very common for writers. A few things sort of go into the soup. I was thinking about third man syndrome. Do you know third man syndrome? Something about? Okay. I won't go too heavy into the hardcore nerdery of like Arctic survival stories, because this is a very special interest subject of mine. So there is a very famous story about a polar explorer, Anne Shackleton, who on one of his journeys, and I will not ruin this for you, because if you are into survival stories, a story of the endurance is like the best, most unbelievable survival story, which it's just riveting. Towards the end of Shackleton's journey, Shackleton and his companions are walking across this sort of Arctic landscape. Was it Antarctic? And they start to believe that there is another person among them. So there's three of them, and they all say in their diaries, we had this sense that there was a fourth man among us. They interpreted this in a very sort of Christological way. They felt it was Jesus guiding them on this part of their journey. This has become known as third man syndrome, where sort of people in times of crisis, usually survival stories, will feel the presence of like another person with them in a comforting, supportive way, a sort of witness or I don't know, spiritually comforting. And I had been thinking about, well, what if you had that sense of an extra person in a moment of crisis, but it wasn't a comforting feeling? What if it was a kind of malevolent feeling? That, there's almost like a malignant witness to your moment of crisis. And so I've been thinking about that. And also about the sort of natural uncanniness of British seaside towns out of season and how they have this totally organic gothic sensibility and this just natural eeriness. Like anyone who's been to a seaside town out of season has that feeling, it's like a theatre with all the audience and just the people aren't there, everything's a little bit shabby. It's just deeply uncanny. So I think those two elements combined led to the haunted shipwreck, well, maybe not haunted, depending on how you want to read it, on a Scottish island. And I think those were probably the key elements. Yeah.
And this novel is set in the 1960s. The one you wrote before was in the 1920s, and I think the work before then was also set in 50s and 60s. So what exactly is it about the 20th century that you find more exciting, and what was it like doing research for all these different books?
That's a good question. What is it about the 20th century? That's a good question. I think really, really historical fiction, so 1700s maybe, or further back, 1800s, it leaves me a little bit cold, if I'm being completely honest. I want to put a huge disclaimer on this, like not all books, like obviously not all authors. There are a lot of really responsible and thoughtful authors working in this space, but I think as a reader, it often, to me personally, feels quite white-coded. And it's just always felt a little bit, I've always just felt a little bit distant from it. So it isn't I write for the reader that I am, and so I wouldn't be my natural place to start. Also, honestly, there's so much research that is involved in writing historical fiction that is further back in time. I mean, for my book in the 1920s, I had to do so much research, and it was unbelievably frustrating because you're writing a scene like, oh, she buttoned up her dress, and then you have to be like, oh, wait, did that kind of dress have buttons? On what side would it have been? Could she have done it herself? Would someone else would it have to do? Would the buttons be made of? And then that takes 40 minutes out of your writing time. That's not why I don't write historical fiction in the 1800s, but it's why maybe the process doesn't appeal to me as much. So that's partly why. What kind of research should we do? So usually my process is that I read for about 6 months. Everything I can get my hand on, maybe even a year for each of my novels. So the first one, Things Bright and Beautiful, was set in the South Pacific in the 1950s. My second novel, Belladonna, is set in Italy towards the end of the 50s, so like 59. Hazardous Spirits is set in 1920, and this one is set in 1962. So yes, I usually read for about a year, 6 months to a year, absorb everything I can, and then I start writing once everything's in, and then I can just improvise after that. For this book, I did speak to a marine archaeologist at the University of Edinburgh, who I did invite tonight, but she's not in the country, who was able to really help me with some of the more practical details because I can barely swim. None of the underwater scenes are anything to do with me. This is all fabrication based on, real research, but total invention with the help of a real-life female marine archaeologist.
That's fascinating because some of the scenes that you've written are so compelling. I was half convinced that you'd be a professional diver.
No, never, ever, would never. Don't mess with the sea. No.
Okay. So that brings us to Marta. I think Marta is a very engrossing protagonist to follow. She has a very interesting, cool job. She works for a museum. She has a very interesting, complex relationship with her boss, to whom she's married, right? And I think there's just so much nuance in that, in her. I wonder what it was like to write her, given that she's not the most likable person you come across in the book. She's also someone who can be very judgmental. You see some self-pity as well. And so what was it like to write Marta?
So yeah, Marta is not a very likable character. I mean, whatever that means. She's pretty problematic. She was actually worse in the earlier drafts, and I had to fight my editors. They made me take out a whole bunch of stuff that made her way less likable and much more despicable, and I really wanted it in. And now seeing how much readers don't like her, I kind of wish I had just gone all the way and just made her just terrible. But the point of the novel is that it's kind of about someone who isn't very likable, but who wants to be, who's asking the question of themselves about, are they redeemable? And who's interested in redemption. And I sort of wanted to challenge, I suppose, the reader in a way to think about that sort of the tension there between being in the head of someone who's not particularly likable, and maybe you get very frustrated with them, but who is fundamentally interested or grappling with the idea of redemption and whether they can be saved, I suppose, or whether they can be changed, or whether they, if there's anything sort of left in them that even wants to be a better person. I tried writing this in the third person. It didn't work, and it really had to be, I think, a first person perspective in order to put the reader really in the point of view of someone who is kind of a bit almost frustrating with their tendency to self-pity and to be the victim in their own story. This is something, again, that I'm interested in more generally, is like characters who aren't the main protagonists, who don't feel that they are the main characters in their own story. So I'm kind of interested in sidekicks, I guess. So, for example, in Hazardous Spirits, it's not the woman herself who hears spirits; it's her husband, and the book is told from the perspective of the woman. And in Things Bright and Beautiful, it's about a woman whose husband is a missionary, and she's sort of dragged along on his missions. And in the Salvage, even though Marta's our protagonist, in a way, I felt that she doesn't cast herself as the main character in her own story either. For a while, she thinks it's a lover, and then I would argue that she also lets the sort of creature, the ghostly, haunting apparition, be the main character in her story as well. So she's that's kind of that's the sort of perspective, I suppose, that I'm more interested in when I'm writing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned redemption, because I guess the idea of redemption has been very central to religion for a long time, and religion is something that keeps coming up in your work. It plays an important role here in the Salvage, where a lot of local people in the island where the whole story is set feel that they've been chosen by God, that they are the divine elect. As a concept, I find that really fascinating, because it's also the foundational logic for so many settler colonial projects across the world. But then also, I feel like religion has been an important, or spiritualism has played an important role in your last book. And I'm also conscious of the fact that you have a PhD in theology. So, so do you mind sharing a bit about your fascination
Sure.
with religion?
So I have a PhD in theology, and religiosity is something I'm really interested in my fiction. I think the reason, the way I came to theology is that I started as a historian, and then sort of, I suppose, felt personally that it's very hard to disentangle what we call a history from religion, really until very recently, if you could even argue at all. And so I felt that it was, as a kind of researcher, that I would have to really learn more and feel more comfortable thinking very critically and seriously about religion in order to be a better historian. And now I'm a novelist. Look what that took me. So I'm really interested in religiosity, and I'm really interested in whether religiosity interacts with people's personal decisions, and really I'm interested in the way it interacts with the historical imaginary and how it sort of shapes people's perspectives on the world, on their worldviews, I suppose. And all of my characters interact with religion and religiosity in one way or another, and I suppose they're all asking the sort of questions about how far can you be a religious person and still make bad decisions. What does religiosity offer people in terms of redemption, in terms of comfort, in terms of challenge, in terms of, I don't know, even just being obstructive. So it's definitely a subject matter that I'm very interested in. I'm sorry, you said something at the beginning of your question I was going to respond to, and now I can't remember what it was.
Spiritualism in the last novel?
No, don't worry.
Okay. Right. So, do you also want to share more about the scene in which Marta is left out of the shelter, which I think is a very interesting point in the novel, because it's the consequence of people's belief in religion that sort of leads to her exclusion, and that plays an important role in, I guess, bringing out the worst in her. So do you just want to share a bit about that?
Thank you, that's great. I remember now what I was going to say is that the book is set on a fictional island, and it's the local population is very invested in a very hyperbolic, exaggerated kind of Calvinism, where basically they believe in the elect. I don't know if that's a familiar concept. So basically the idea is that only 144,000 people can be saved and they can be redeemed and they go on to heaven. And those people have basically been predestined by God, almost like before the beginning of time, really, since the history of the world. And those are the only ones who are saved. And everyone else is doomed. But there's no way to know if you are saved or if you're doomed. The only way that you can know is that a saved person behaves like a saved person would, because they're completely pure. So they perform perfectly good actions, they live a perfectly good life, right? And so what that creates is this kind of element of, I mean, this is not my theory, this is just like a general theory about this kind of belief system. It creates an atmosphere of self-surveillance and community surveillance, where what you're watching for is signs in yourself that you're saved because you never do anything wrong, and signs that your neighbour is not saved because there's only a limited number of seats on the bus, right? So how do you know if you're on the bus or not? You don't. You just have to have a perfect, rule-abiding life and hope that that is your inner nature showing through. So that's the environment that Marta finds herself in. Now, Marta is already kind of a self-pitying, a pretty paranoid person. And so when she enters this situation, this island, it's set in 62, so it's over the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there's a scene in the novel where the inhabitants of the island don't permit her in to the shelter with her. And this obviously, as you said, brings out the worst in her. For that, what I was thinking of is really, yes, she's a very paranoid person, but you know, that saying, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that they're not out to get you. That's what I'm thinking of. Now, this plays on Marta's worst fears because she already is grappling with some internal grief and guilt. So when you emphasize that insider-outsider dynamic and she's actually fundamentally deemed as an outsider, it kicks off all of those worst qualities in herself. And I think, you know, she is sort of in limbo for a bit of the book in the sense that she doesn't really know if she even really wants to be redeemed or not. And I think being cast as the outsider just kickstarts this whole freak out process that propels her through the rest of the book.
Right. Another question I have about Marta is why you chose to place her in a museum. The reason I ask this is because I think for someone who's not really aware of the many people who can be employed in a museum, it feels very interesting that someone who's a professional diver would work for one. But also, I think I'm thinking of how many exhibitions in the 20th century were essentially responsible for creating an imperial world that people could engage with. And so she's someone who works for a museum and it is also involved in getting items from a shipwreck for another museum that has specific plans for an exhibition about this old white guy who went on who went to sail towards the Arctic in the 19th century. And so were you invested in the question of institutional preservation of people like James Bory? Or is there more to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was thinking of museums in this context as kind of instruments of colonialism and curators of a particular colonial perspective and worldview. In the novel, Marta, this is 1962, she's a female marine archaeologist. This did not exist. Basically, marine archaeology had existed for like 1 year. So I took a lot of liberties there. Like, it's just about feasible. So the way that she actually works for a museum, okay, that's all fabricated, kind of sort of bit of authorial spice. But what I was interested in there is her acting as an arm of the machine of a long span of colonial interpretation and framing of particular perspectives on indigeneity, on like material culture, on heroes and heroism, and who gets to tell the story of heroic expeditions, of explorers in general. I mean, the concept of explorers is something that, at least in England, is very unproblematized. So that was the linkage there. Yeah.
I think we just have a few minutes, so maybe I'll ask one or two questions, and then we'll turn to the audience. What were your literary influences for the novel, and were you also in chat with some other people who were writing about the Big Freeze? I'm thinking of Andrew Miller, who wrote The Land in Winter, which was recently nominated for the Booker Prize.
Yeah, I had no idea about Andrew Miller's book till it was shortlisted, which is wasn't even on my radar at all. I have not read it. It's just a pure coincidence. Very interesting, though. I think that there's, basically no other novels about this period. I think there was one, maybe in the mid '60s, but there's functionally no other novels about this winter. And then 2 books were written about this winter in the space of a year. And that is very interesting. Obviously, this period of time, I was surprised by how much synchronicity or parallels I could see, obviously, with our current moment. 62, I think it was Philip Larkin who said, like, sex was invented in 1963. And I was kind of interested in not that moment of the turning point, which is what I think quite a lot of the time historians, even fiction writers, are very interested in those big moments of change. But I was more invested in the deep freeze before that moment of change, and that winter. It was really the first time that in popular culture we were having conversations about climate, about because of Rachel Carson wrote this very influential book called Silent Spring that was all about basically climate crisis, about nuclear fears of obliteration, and lots of worrying about whether Britain should be part of essentially the EU. What was the EU at the time? I did find a lot of resonances with the present day. But I had no idea about Andrew Miller's book, so that was just a pure coincidence. Was it in conversation with anyone else? I can't say that it was, but after having written it, I discovered a really amazing vein of Arctic gothic horror thrillers, like Michelle Paver's written a couple of them, absolutely amazing, so great. There's The Terror, which actually I have to confess I have not read because it was so similar to my source material. I didn't want to read it in case I would unconsciously absorb it, which is just such an amazing story anyway. So it's definitely on the bookshelf with those other books, but not directly inspired by them.
Okay, and maybe one last question before we turn to the audience. Are you working on any new project right now?
I'm going. I'm not really. I've started researching a book about. So I'm Scottish Palestinian, set in Jerusalem in the 40s, which is very loosely based on my grandfather, who's still alive. He's 100. His real life entanglement with Arthur Koestler, who was a writer from the 40s, who was based in Jerusalem at that time. So I'm kind of playing around with that a little bit. I think it's going to take me quite a long time to write. I'm going to say that it's my effort to resist the urge of capitalism to keep producing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your question.
Thank you. We have some questions online. If you want to start with these,
amazing.
While you guys warm up to what you want to ask. So the first one is from Layla, who says, "Hi, I've loved the book so far, almost at the end, and I can't wait. I've just been reading Palestine -1. Did you know it? It's a collection of sci-fi, fantasy, retrospective Palestinian writing. And it's my first encounter with Palestinian Gothic or ghost stories. I wondered if you draw from a Palestinian literary tradition as much as a Scottish one in the spiritual Gothic side of the book."
Oh, that's a great question. I'd love to say yes. Not really. I'm still also slowly getting my feet wet in Palestinian Gothic. I did read an incredible book earlier this year called the Palace on the Two Hills, which is just a fantastic Palestinian true Gothic novel. Ghosts, hauntings, crumbling mansions, settler colonialism, everything that you could possibly want. But not really. I wouldn't say that this is a Palestinian Gothic book, but I wrote it during the genocide. Obviously, it was very much on my mind. And even though this book is not about Palestine at all, what I will say is that I was thinking of two things. I was thinking very much of the kind of like deep freeze before what I hope to be sort of profound moments of like social and cultural transformation, a la the winter of 1962. And I was also thinking of Marta's experience as a woman who is essentially being gaslit by everyone around her, telling her that what she materially feels and knows to be true is not happening, which is this spectre that is following her everywhere. And that her environment is fundamentally alien, I suppose, to her, and in that way is not supporting her experience of real world events. So to that extent, I was writing from a place of Palestinian Gothic, even though you wouldn't necessarily read that in the text if you didn't know that. But yeah, thank you for the question.
Is there one in the room? There's another one online if you need a beat longer. Okay, this is from Raya. Oh, you go first, and then I'll do Raya.
Well, this sounds incredibly interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I guess one of my questions, specifically on the archaeology side of it, I really liked what you sort of mentioned about the idea of hauntings and archaeology. I do think that the conceit of archaeology is highly underused in horror, but the haunting of something that is stolen or part of a colonial project that is then utilized, and a specter that haunts an individual. Sometimes it's a specter within the colonized people, and sometimes it's the specter of guilt of what you've done. And considering Scotland's own history as part of the UK and as a nation that has also in some ways benefited from the colonial project, I was sort of wondering how much you were really in conversation with that as you
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was very much in conversation with that. I went through such a deep rabbit hole of, and none of this really made it into the book. This is all part of the process of going through, all of these, the records of enslavement, which you can now see online, of basically the Scottish landowners who profited and were profiteering from enslavement, and the direct amounts and number of enslaved people that they were responsible for overseeing / their deaths of. Absolutely horrendous. This was months of work that in the end did not make it into the book, but I was very much informed by thinking about the wider colonial project and the way that Scottish families and individuals were deeply intertwined in that network, and that to an extent that's how the Purdy family in this book, they are representative. I should say this is not a real family. That's a real name. This is not based on a real family, but it's their legacy is 1,000% based on real Scottish landowners. And in fact, originally I had named and shamed, and my editor made me take some names out of real families that have from profiteering from enslavement and colonial prizes. So, which is probably for the best. But yes, that thank you. That's a great question.
Thank you.
I feel like Raya's question is connected to this one. So I'm interested in some of the ethics of salvage or archaeology and who has ownership over history. There was such interesting tensions in the book on this. Could you talk a little bit about it?
That's a great question because it reflects, I guess, what sort of things that we've been talking about in the room. that's a question in the book. I think it's a question that archaeologists are still asking of themselves, and I suppose as a science and as an enterprise, I suppose as well. How far our our engagement and ownership over like physical material culture represents how the sort of the mirror that we want to hold up to ourselves culturally in terms of what we say about history, and how a lot of this is very celebratory, and you can see the sort of objects that are described in the novel really exist. All of those objects that are taken from the vessel are based on real material objects that I have seen in collections all over Scotland, and it is very interesting to go and see those objects in real life collections and look at the way that they are described, and the sort of celebratory nature, I think, often with which those kind of collections are described. It's a great question, and I think it's something that is still unfolding and unpacking a little bit as we culturally think about deconstructing our quote unquote historical heroes.
Mm-hmm. Is there another one in the room? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
So I come from kind of like one of those coastal towns that you mentioned, and I find it really interesting when you were like, it's really uncanny and really spooky, because like I grew up there and I lived there, and when you're there you don't see it as spooky, you just see it as like a shithole. So it kind of got me thinking about like whether with Marta, when she first like meets this spectre, and at first it's like, oh my god, it's so spooky, and then you kind of live with something, and when you live with something terrifying for a prolonged period of time, you kind of become used to it. And I think that's just kind of a very like human reaction. It's just like adaptation, and I wanted to know whether that is explored still, because I love it when like the relationship with like the main character, but then like the spooky is.
Yeah, I love that too. I think there's something very intimate about being haunted. It can be pretty sexy. It's certainly very intimate. And if you think about the way that like domestic hauntings are represented, it's very rarely like, oh, you're on the number 14 and you're like halfway through Twix, and then you're like, it's all bedrooms, mirrors, bathtubs. There's a sort of domestic intimacy about hauntings, because the way that plays on our fears of not just like our very domestic and personal private spaces being punctured, violated, or even just infiltrated. I suppose it's almost like an insidiousness to it. But that this creature, this apparition that is haunting you knows you. There's a familiarity there. Not only does it know how it's going to freak you out, but it knows the dark secrets of your soul. And so I think you're right, because you can't have, in some ways, like the terror is lessened the longer you live with it, and in some ways I think the terror is worsened the more that intimacy and that bond almost is created between you. It's that sort of the idea of the self and the shadow self. What does that figure really represent? So yeah, I suppose it's both.
Nice. Thank you.
This one's from Julie. You sort of already answered it, but maybe for the next thing. So it was, I've loved the queer plots of some of your books and loved the way you write Scotland and its traditions and language. What's next? More queers and more Scotland, please.
Yeah, I think not Scotland right now, but I do have another Scottish story I would really like to write. My editor has not heard about this, so I feel nervous about mentioning this. But do you guys know what the concept of the rapture is? It's like where people are like seized and taken up to heaven, right, before the end of the world. So as a nerd, a history nerd, one of the sort of in the historical record, that one of the origin stories of the rapture is actually a prophecy from a 15-year-old girl in Glasgow called Margaret MacDonald. And so I would love to write a queer coded / retelling of Margaret MacDonald's accidental invention of the rapture, which is something that I am tooling around with. But yeah, my editor has not heard about this, so I hope that I'm not going to give her a heart attack by debuting this now. Yeah.
It's a great answer. I'm sure Julie's thrilled. Is there another one in the room? I'm being shy. Waiting to see if somebody else pops one online.
Great. Anything else you wanted to wrap up with? Or?
I was wondering if you want to briefly mention the workshop on Sunday.
That's a good point. Yeah. So on Sunday, I'm doing an event with Scottish BPOC Writers Network, and we're meeting at the Melting Pot in Edinburgh. It's from 12 till 2. It is for BPOC writers only, but, spread the word. And we're looking at writing, friendship and allyship in historical fiction.
Cool. It's just nice messages from people saying thank you,
No,
rather
than...
than...
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining online. I really appreciate it.
Actually, since you mentioned allyship, in the book, there's this real, sense of the bond between her and Elsie and how it gets formed out of a place of, it's either a crush, and it's just like, I just like this beautiful woman, and it being the outsider and being a queer person on an island that has found someone who, might reciprocate? Or is there a sense of her as the person who steps in to be like, you are an outsider, but you're always welcome here, and reaches and just doesn't seem to see her as an outsider any more than anyone else that rocks up at the hotel, and simultaneously keeps reminding her and using the language of like, oh, it's okay, it's just because they think of you as an outsider.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think I wrote my second novel was set in a convent. I couldn't do that again. But as far as possible, I really wanted this to feel like a book that is a conversation between women. And the main characters are Marta and Elsie, her love interest, who is based on the island. And then there's a third character, Sophie, who enters the plot a little bit later. And I was really invested in the dynamics, I think, especially between Marta and Sophie as an unlikely ally, because while Elsie is there's an element of, I suppose, she's definitely a truth teller, but Sophie is initially kind of an antagonist for Marta, and Sophie actually represents a lot of the outsider dynamics that Marta is convinced that she represents. Sophie is much more of an outsider in every single way to this island, really. And yet, Marta's so sort of self-pitying that she's not able to see that. And having those two characters sort of being an antagonist and yet still forming an allyship through the novel was a really fun thing for me as a writer to get to do, is to create a circumstance where we are really looking at just this sort of supportive relationship between three women who have completely different perspectives on the island in which they have found themselves.
It's really well done. It's great to read.
Yes.
I haven't actually read the book yet. I'm looking forward to it. I was really interested in the role of the haunting and thinking about sort of like famous, real kind of curses and hauntings and things, especially tied up in the kind of colonial narrative of kind of exoticization of objects of space and of the time, and how central that is, like, particularly around like Egyptology, for instance, and the curse on the pharaohs and all this kind of like ways of kind of othering and exoticizing part of the kind of colonial exploration. That was a long-winded way of saying. What was there any kind of real, in inverted commas, hauntings that kind of inspired this, particularly perhaps as they relate to ways of like relating?
I mean, not really. There is in a way, as a teenager, this was terrified me. I can't explain why. This figure of Spring-heeled Jack, who was a Victorian invention, London, specifically urban population haunting. And Spring-heeled Jack was this sort of, sometimes he was like a serpentine creature, sometimes he was just a dude in like a top hat. And he would crawl into your rooms. He could just sort of leap across the rooftops. He would crawl into your rooms, and then you would really only know that he'd been there by the footsteps on your ceiling, knowing that he'd been in the room with you while you were sleeping. I know, just absolutely horrifying. And I think as a younger person, it's absolutely horrified me because A, of the very urban setting, and B, because of this idea of a kind of, I mean, obviously it's very violating, just the idea of like a male coded figure in a female space, just like observing you in a space of vulnerability. You're sleeping, horrible. I mean, that, although it's not, strictly a kind of, it's not really like an othering haunting, although there certainly are lots of examples of that. This is a very Victorian coded terror of the other, of like, responding to obviously like fears of rapid industrialization and things that could not be named and that have been sort of swept away, I suppose, by rationality, and therefore begin to like build their own mythology, which is always really compelling. And I think setting the story during this deep freeze with the accompanying like claustrophobia, you're trapped, it's winter, the lights are out. What I was thinking of is that space in Calvinism where, okay, so if everyone's saved or you're doomed, then where do the ghosts come in? And there's so much ghostly stuff in textbook hardcore Calvinism of this type in the book. So much second sight, so many fairies and weird sightings, and it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't theologically makes no sense at all. And I think it's partly the same place that Spring-heeled Jack occupies. It's like when you've got the world into these very strict categories, there's still that little middle bit that doesn't quite capture the full human experience, and then everything that gets crammed in there just gets weirder and weirder and weirder. And then when the lights go out, you start to hear things.
And on that weird note, a sinister note to end on, it's 8 o'clock. So I think
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming, being with us on this call.
Thank you.
Creepy evening. Yeah.
We've got a wee table next door, so you can come through and get a book signed or ask a question you're too shy to ask. If you had a hot chocolate mug, just leave it on the corner of the table on the way through. But will you join me in thanking Anbara and Mridula for tonight's event?